We commit to reflecting on how we can better treat each other, pursue justice, and uphold the calls to action through Truth and the Reconciliation Commission. We also acknowledge that all past, as well as those who have arrived as migrants, similar to me. We specifically recognize that those who came to these lands involuntarily, particularly those who were brought through the transatlantic slave trade and the system of slavery, we pay tribute to the ancestors of those with their African origin and descent, whose labor, knowledge, and resilience and survival continue to shape these lands in the Americas, food systems, and communities that we are part of today. This edition has been modeled through the African ancestral acknowledgement that Toronto, the city of Toronto, has done, which I will link in the chat.
Thanks for
I
that.
think Of course, yeah. I think especially when we do land acknowledgements in Black History Month and in a session where we're talking about Black food sovereignty, that we understand all of the different complicated ways that people of African origin have come to this land, but also upholding our commitment to Indigenous solidarity and sovereignty on these lands. I'm gonna pass it to Peachtree to get to the next slide, James, if that's okay.
Okay, just a little bit about the NFU University. We have a new structure for the university classes. Lectures will be followed by organizing sessions a week later. We invite everyone to attend organizing sessions to work collaboratively for policy change that serve farmers. And for a schedule of upcoming classes or to register for a class, or to see videos of the past classes, just go to www.nfu.ca and click on the blue button marked NF University.
Next
Okay.
slide.
And if there's any information that you want to learn or know about NF University, this is where you can find it, either on our website, nfu.ca/join/. And there's also in French for folks that speak French.
Next slide. So for today's session, we're going to split it into two parts. We're going to have speakers speak for a total of 50-ish minutes, including, I think me and Peachtree will have things to add when we're transitioning from topic to topic. And then we'll have a session for us to open that up for questions, to have a conversation. We're going to be doing this more, especially in the season of Black History Month, in a circle process, especially because those are ways that people of African origin have really facilitated conversations. Next slide. So we're going to open it up and I'm going to pass it to Peachtree to kind of maybe ground more uh, in the dynamic of why we're having to play video for Dominique instead of her being able to be with us in person.
Yes, of course. Thank you for that. Okay, so this picture of this beautiful person is Miss Nadine Dominique, and she is currently in Haiti, Cap Rouge, which is where she has been for quite a few years, facilitating reforestation efforts, and particularly with ancestral trees in Haiti. Geez, I met her many years ago while venturing around the space, as a Caribbean descendant, really talking to people that were doing land work. There's also a reforestation space behind my home in Trinidad, and was quite intrigued and interested to learn of the work that she was doing. And unfortunately, just leading towards what Adama was saying, she has been unable to connect with me online for the last week. I think we've had one 5-minute conversation before the phone dropped. Internet access is always a huge issue in the global South. And she really, really wanted to be here. She was so excited, but unfortunately, she can't be here. So we have found a short video that we can play showing the work that she's doing currently in Haiti.
So we're gonna get James, our awesome staff, to play the video.
Can everyone see that okay?
Looking good.
Thanks,
Di
Paul.
baba let ba mi no san naivo. Di baba let ba mi no san naivo. Alet ba sen. Alet ba sa gimaje awe.
This is a nursery. We had it for 3 years now. And it's full of trees. You see, the bags are to replace the ones that were distributed, because we distribute a lot. I'm Nadine Dominique. I'm the director of OBEC, Organization for the Betterment of Cap Rouge. We're a reforestation project. We're creating food forests. We're doing reforestations of degraded areas, ravines. There's fruit trees, there are forest trees, there's trees for charcoal, there's medicinal trees, there's trees for animal feeding. We concentrate on the local that used to grow, because I talked to the old people that used to grow in the environment. They used to have cacao, they used to have pomegranate, they used to have a bunch of trees that we don't see anymore. So we're planting those. And I find that the inflation is hitting the community really hard. Food is expensive. So I feel like now there's been a rush. They've been coming to get trees. A lot of trees, especially coffee, the fruit trees, right? The citruses, all the other ones, the Mayan nuts. Somebody came and got 40 yesterday and the day before. So people feel the urgency of planting to eat, because now it's almost unaffordable. I don't know if it's the right word, unaffordable. The main problem we have in Cap Rouge, and I mean it is getting worse because of the climate crisis, it's the water situation. There is no water distribution systems, a communal thing, there is nothing like that. Everybody collects a little bit of water from the roofs every rain with a very tiny cistern, and that's what they use to eat, cook, wash, bathe. They don't water the lands, they don't water their crops because there is no water available for that. I went to Benin. I was in Benin for the Vodou festival, and I came back with baobab. Baobab becomes a giant tree. Giant. It becomes. I've seen some big like this building here, and the quality of it. Its root go fetch water. It goes through the soil, goes through rocks, and bring the water. So we started a program of reforesting the degraded ravines further up the hill, and the next step is to go where the old springs used to spring out, to plant trees in their heads, on the heads of the springs, so it could bring back the water. Cultural capital Haiti is really cool to want to work towards that vision with us.
Di baba let baba pam di ma kout mwen nan do mwen. Di ma prive nan gan cheme wa ouve baye pou mwen yo.
Thank you for playing that video. Paul, I see your face. Yeah, like I said, I wish that she was here and that we could have a chance to interact with her. She's very cool people. She actually is from Quebec, Montreal, Haitian descent, moved back to Haiti to do this impressive work. And in particularly, we were connected around seed work. Like, how are we preserving our cultural seeds across the regions, and how are we connecting with each other? And I was very interested and excited to learn about the work of reforestation and even growing, in the Caribbean, we have silk cotton trees, and those are quite spiritual trees. You tend to find mass burial sites beside silk cotton trees, and she was distributing silk cotton trees to families to start regrowing across the Caribbean. And that is how myself and uh, Nadine Dominique connected. So hopefully at the working group, she'll be able to come and have a bit of a conversation with folks at that time, or maybe she can send us a little video if that's easier for her.
I absolutely agree. I think what's really important about having Nadine Dominique be a part of today's session and even having the ability to see the reforestation project in Haiti is the significance that Haiti has in the Black radical tradition as the first enslaved colony to liberate themselves and also have a huge role in the liberation of so many around the Americas. So it's really beautiful that Nadine's work really deeply connects to that ongoing history. We'll move on to our next speaker. Isaac, um, are you? Yes, awesome.
Hi. Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk about, my talk is basically about racial capitalism and the system of farming and land liberation and life-making farming, racial capitalism and the struggle for food sovereignty. And it's kind of apropos here because we're talking about self-determination, we're talking about self-reliance on Black communities. And right now in my province, and I have to mention the current development, our provincial government just announced its new budget, which includes a series of cuts to Black programs right across in terms of education. In fact, in some cases, completely wiping out their government funding that was made, or grants that were made to various programs and so forth. It's a moment of crisis here in the community as people are wrestling with this issue. And it comes back to once again to this question of economic independence, economic self-reliance, and the vulnerability when we stand in face of the state as well. And of course, some of the funding they've cut, right, are funding that's not just simply to education. It's funding that funds things like bus passes, right, and a whole number of other things that people need in order to get to work and so on. And of course, all of that connects to food insecurity, where Nova Scotians, for example, African Nova Scotians, are disproportionately spend more than 30% of their income on rent and so forth. So there's all of these vulnerabilities, and we lack the information, but we know there's a significant amount of lack of nutrition and so forth among the communities here. That being said, when we think of farming, it's often described as an economic activity, a sector of production measured in yield, exports, and gross domestic product. This language is not neutral. It reflects the worldview of racial capitalism, a system that reduces land to commodity, labor to input, and food to profit. But farming is not merely an economic activity. It is a system, a total social relation that organizes how people relate to land, to one another, to labor, to gender, to memory, and to power. To understand land under racial capitalism is to understand that dispossession is not incidental to the system. It is foundational. Under racial capitalism, land is stripped of its meaning as the ground of life, and transformed into an instrument of capital accumulation. Okay, agriculture becomes agribusiness. Farmers become producers. Communities become labor reservoirs. Food becomes a commodity circulated for profit rather than nourishment. Yet for Black communities across the Atlantic world, land has never been simply an economic resource. It has been the material basis of autonomy, spirituality, and survival. In short, farming structures social relations, labor, gender, power, ecology, and sovereignty. This truth is not abstract. My mother comes from a Black loyalist community in Nova Scotia. Arriving in 1783, these are parts of communities formed by former enslaved Africans who, during the American War of Independence, the so-called American Revolution, were promised land and freedom by the British in return for joining the British side. When they arrived in Nova Scotia after the British were defeated, what they received instead were marginal plots, rocky soil, infertile ground, geographic isolation. And anybody who's been to Nova Scotia, we often hear of a talk of 45, 46, upwards of 51, 52 historical Black communities. And people always notice the geographical isolation, how disparate they are spread across the province, often on the outskirts of our towns and small cities, right? Far enough away to be socially separate, okay, but close enough to come in and work as cheap labor. And because the land they're on is not viable land. And of course, this led to a number of sundown towns where if you were Black, you were allowed in the dawn in order to do the cheap labor, but at sunset you had to leave or you faced all sorts of serious repercussions. So in a sense, the impoverishment of the community was not accidental. It was structural. Its disfranchisement was deliberate. They were not landless because of misfortune. They were landless by design. That design echoes across the African diaspora. Enslavement severed Africans from land and reorganized them as chattel property. Colonialism converted land into plantation monoculture. Sharecropping in the U.S. South locked Black farmers into cycles of debt peonage. Urban development displaced Black rural communities. Structural adjustment programs across Africa and the Caribbean dismantled national food systems in favor of export-oriented production. The concentration of land in settler, colonial, or comprador hands was not poor planning, it was strategy, a method of controlling labor and extracting wealth. Some of people may be familiar with Harry Haywood. He's very famous for writing a memoir called Black Bolshevik, but he was also a theorist and an activist, but a particular theorist on Black self-determination and actually what we call the Black Belt Nation thesis in the U.S. South. He recognized this reality in his articulation of the Black Belt thesis. He argued that African Americans in the U.S. South constituted an oppressed nation, concentrated in a geographic territory, and that the struggle for liberation required self-determination rooted in land. For Haywood, civil rights were insufficient without material control over territory and resources. Land, therefore, was not symbolic. It represented sovereignty, independence, and a foundation for self-determination. The agrarian question, therefore, was inseparable from the national question. Thus, as I said, land is not symbolic. It is material power. The concept of food sovereignty extends this insight into the contemporary period. Too often reduced to policy jargon, food sovereignty is a material practice. It demands answers to fundamental questions. Who owns the land? Who controls the seeds? Who determines what is grown? Who benefits from the harvest? Food sovereignty insists that communities have the right to define their own agricultural systems, prioritize local production, and resist corporate monopolies over food and distribution. Planting becomes political practice. Harvesting becomes an assertion of autonomy. Farming becomes a site of resistance. In the case of the Caribbean, the vulnerability illustrates the consequences of historical dispossession. The plantation economy did not disappear. It mutated. Many Caribbean nations now import the majority of their food, even as they remain vulnerable to hurricanes, climate change, and volatile global markets. And I should add here, given the recent hyper-escalation of the U.S. economic war against Cuba, they obviously are vulnerable to the vagaries and the viciousness of U.S. imperialism. We just have to look at how supine the CARICOM nations have been forced to become before the imperial might of the United States. And in many cases in Caribbean islands, tourism displaces agricultural land. Trade liberalization undermines local farmers. The economy is once organized around sugar exports, now depend on imported staples. Dependency is not an unfortunate byproduct of globalization. It is the afterlife of plantation capitalism. Consequently, dependency is not mismanagement, it is the continuation of plantation capitalism. And in fact, there's a growing amount of scholarship that treats slavery as part and parcel, right, of capitalism itself, not only the origin of capitalism, but the functioning of capitalism and so forth. There's an excellent book called Accounting for Slavery, which looks at how management systems, right, have so rooted in this dehumanizing, degrading and shall we say, laceration of African humanity. Across Africa, liberation movements understood that political independence without agrarian transformation would be hollow. Amilcar Cabral insisted that the liberation of Guinea-Bissau and Cabo Verde required rebuilding rural life. And it is no coincidence that Cabral, who I think is probably the greatest African intellectual, right, of the second half of the 20th century, right? And I encourage people to read his work, Weapon as a Theory, and his writings and so forth. I don't think it's a coincidence that he was an agronomist, right? And he used his training as agronomist against the Portuguese colonizers, right, to understand and to come to a deep understanding of the society and the life in Guinea-Bissau and Cabo Verde. In liberated zones of Cabo Verde and Guinea-Bissau during the liberation struggle, schools, clinics, and collective farming initiatives were established even before independence was won. For Cabral, culture and land were inseparable. Reclaiming land was reclaiming historical agency. And as we were witnessing what's unfolding in Sahel Africa, particularly in Niger, Mali, and in Burkina Faso, and particularly in Burkina Faso under Traore, we were reminded of Thomas Sankara, who led the revolution in Burkina Faso, actually renamed Burkina Faso from Upper Volta to Burkina Faso, and asserted Burkina Faso's independence and self-determination. And in 1983 1987, until he was assassinated, he, as I said, he advanced this similar vision in Burkina Faso. He championed land reform, ecological renewal, and food self-sufficiency under the principle, he who feeds you controls you. Under his leadership, agricultural production increased as the country prioritized feeding its own people and satisfying external markets. Food independence was national sovereignty in practice. And of course, he was eventually assassinated orchestrated by compradors within Burkina Faso at the behest of the French imperial power. Frelimo in Mozambique reorganized rural society within liberated zones, integrating agriculture production with political education and social transformation. Women were not peripheral participants, they were central actors. Okay, combatants, organizers, farmers, and leaders. And I go back to Cabral. Cabral used to talk about the liberation fighters as armed militants, right? Not soldiers who were militants, right? Because at the end of the day, these militants who had won liberation would have to go back to farming, would have to go back to reorganizing their societies and so forth. And we have something similar in Frelimo, because there's an excellent book called Red Africa, written by Keith Ocheng, which looks at the experiences we can learn from Lusophone Africa. And I should also drag the point here that, when we look at what's happening in Angola and Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau and Cabo Verde, we have to bear in mind that these emancipatory projects accomplished a tremendous amount, but always emerged under siege and were deliberately sabotaged and undermined by tremendous external imperial pressure, whether economic or, in the case of Angola and Mozambique, through that invasion from the apartheid South African state at the time and the sponsoring of various terrorist bands, right? And similarly, as I said, in Angola, other movements confronted the agrarian questions as central to the national struggle. In these contexts, land reform was not technocratic adjustment, it was revolutionary restructuring. Okay? And political independence without land reform is incomplete, as we've learned in places like Zimbabwe, and it's increasingly becoming apparent in South Africa. So crucially, women's participation transformed the meaning of land. And in fact, there's if anybody is familiar, one of the best television series or documentary series produced in Africa, and there's sort of three main ones. There's one produced by Louis Skip Gates, who is a professor from Harvard University and appears frequently on PBS. There's one produced by the great African historian Ali Mazrui, and then there's one produced by the English historian Basil Davidson, which many Africanists, right, and Pan-Africanists consider the best. It's dated from 1984. The last episode, which is episode 8, looks at the empowerment of women in Mozambique, right? This is before Samora Machel is assassinated in 1986. He was the leader of Mozambique at that time. And they look at this empowerment of women as they take control of farming, as they take control of their lives. So I encourage people to watch it because it's quite powerful, listening to the testimony of women and seeing them in action, right? So as I said, crucially, women's participation transformed the meaning of land. Agrarian reform without gender transformation reproduces hierarchy. Across liberation movements, women's leadership in production and governance demonstrated that land is not merely territorial control, but social transformation. When women gain access to land, communities gain resilience. Land becomes a site not only of national emancipation, but gender emancipation. Thus, land must be understood as self-emancipation. It is not charity granted by the state or concession negotiated through markets. It is the material foundation of autonomy and self-determination. To control land is to shape political life, economic direction, and ecological stewardship. This is precisely why racial capitalism must separate dispossessed peoples from land. Dispossession creates dependency. This dependency secures control. From black loyalist communities in Nova Scotia to the Black Belt in the southern United States, from Guinea-Bissau to Burkina Faso, from Mozambique to the Caribbean, the struggle for land has always been a struggle for life. To farm is to decide. To plant is to assert a future. To reclaim land is to reclaim the capacity to reproduce community on one's own terms. We are not landless by accident. We are landless by design. But design can be dismantled. Systems can be transformed. And land as a site of life-making rather than profit-making can once again become the ground of freedom. Thus, we must pose and confront the key question: who controls the land and for whom does it produce life? Thank you.
Isaac, just before we move on, what was the name of the documentary that you had said? You're on mute. You're on mute.
It's not a webinar unless somebody forgets to take themselves off mute, right? So it's available online. It's called Africa. Okay, and it's by Basil Davidson. So Basil Davidson is, he was involved in the Portuguese liberation struggles. He was, in fact, the only foreign journalist that was invited by Amilcar Cabral and other people in Mozambique and Angola quite often to participate in the revolutionary debates and discussions and deliberations of these revolutionary movements. And the series called Africa. The first one is Africa Different but Equal, and then it goes up. The last one, it's from 1984, so it's somewhat dated, but he looks at particularly Mozambique, and it's quite powerful looking how these women are empowered and so forth by having taken control of the line, taken and now involved farming for themselves, but also farming for the community. And the book I mentioned is Red Africa by Keith Ocheng. And it's a brilliant book and really looks at the promise of the Lusophone liberation projects in Lusophone Africa and Portuguese Africa. And of course, as I said before, those were stymied and undermined by imperial aggression.
I think I have almost all. I added the playlist of Africa and all the episodes. I added the book, like the two books you mentioned. So if I'm missing something, please add it to the chat. Uh, Perfect. Pictures there.
I don't think we have Miss Jackie in the room. We are a little bit in a conflict with another Black farming symposium happening in Ontario, where I think there's some conversations happening with the ministry, and I don't see Miss Jackie in the room.
Yes, Peach, but you said you have a video that we can play.
Would you like me?
Peachtree, could you send me the video over the Zoom chat and I can put it on the screen for everybody. to answer one of the questions in the chat, yes, there will be a recording available for this session for sure.
I'm sorry, James, I didn't hear you. I was trying to send a message to you.
Yeah, I did send James.
All good. I've got it.
Thanks.
Thanks, folks. Can folks see that okay?
Culturally relevant crops that can grow here in the short growing season,
Right.
And also some of the seasonal crops. We don't own land, so sovereignty is tied into ownership. And so we're always advocating against how the system divvy up land and make good arable fertile land accessible and affordable to groups like us. A part and parcel of the mission, because we dwell in the urban space, every little corner that you see, you know, that is available for something green to go there, they plop down concrete blocks on it. So in the very, very near future, we're going to be, you know, we're going to be stifling for fresh air because we hardly see any green trees around us.
True.
And
true.
without trees, we don't get, rainfall is not encouraged, and the air is not clean. When you drive out of the city, I'd say an hour or 2 hours out of the city, it's a totally different ambiance.
Yeah, it is, and the air is
People
clean.
have land, them plant trees,
Right.
them growing them food, they have community. It doesn't matter how the place looks sleepy, it's a community and people know each other. Here in the city, everybody is just on this treadmill of survival.
Right. What are the advantages of organic farming?
Oh my God, so many benefits.
Throw out a few out there.
First, all the land itself, you're giving back so much value and nutrition to the land. The other thing is all the other, you know, animals, insects around you, they also eat what you
Contribute.
grow.
Right.
So they benefit and they keep expanding their population and making the ecosystem healthier. And also too, when you eat clean, your body becomes clean, and what happens is that the fuel that you're giving your body is clean. So when you when your body's secreting any waste,
Yes.
it's not, you know, you don't have to hold your breath,
Right.
because it's clean.
Right,
And
yeah, yeah.
so the more the more we can put into, you know, doing this type of growing clean, respecting the environment, the earth, feeding that to ourselves and each other, I think we'll be healthier. We'll man our eco footprints to the hospitals. You know, we'll spend less time at our doctors. You know, your health is your wealth.
Amen to that.
And so if you don't start to focus and take care of your health, you're going to have some problems in the future.
Right. Now, are organic yields lower? Crop rotation, how essential is that, Jacqueline?
Very essential. I remember, say, 20, 25, 30 years ago, everybody wanted this beautiful green lawn with no weeds growing in there, right?
Right.
And so they would literally put chemicals or pesticides in the soil to prevent that.
Right.
Years after, people started getting sick, they started having all kinds of diseases and cancers. And so when they go back and start to look at their footprints, they started realizing that they were already killing themselves with these chemicals and pesticides. So now, for a lot of younger folks who are buying property, particularly in the city, they're tearing up these lawns. They're planting like small food forests, front and back,
Right.
and they actually live off of that throughout the spring to the summer to the fall.
Great, great. Now, how does organic farming help the environment, and how does organic farming improve soil and water quality?
Oh my God. So
again, if you're not using chemicals, nothing, no chemicals or no pesticides will be seeping into the water table. So that's one big point. Also, again, the pollinators, the insects, all the beneficial insects, you know, the raccoons, the this one, the that one, they all come. Whenever you grow anything, all these little creatures visit you. And I've seen this. If it has chemicals on it, not even the birds would come there.
Really? I didn't know that.
If you drive out of the city and look at these mega farms where it's like 1,000, 2,000 acres, then plant corn and all kind of something, you don't see any birds or any squirrels over there because it is a different type of setup. There's chemicals there and they're not going to eat it. So when I planted some corn this year, some native corn, I didn't get one.
Really?
The raccoons ate them right down to the corn husk and leave it on the tree.
Wow.
It's sweet and it's clean and there's no chemicals and no pesticides, so you're not disrupting the natural formation of things.
Wow.
You're actually inviting all these other, you know, all these other entities around you to come and partake in what you grow. So it is very essential, very important, and very vital, whether you're learning or you're an experienced farmer, to again mind your eco footprint, because what we put in is what we get out.
Absolutely.
And you know, if we want this planet to remain healthy and we want to slow down a lot of things that is rapidly happening to the planet, like, you know, our carbon footprint, we need to really take a stock to our own actions as to what we're putting in the soil that eventually will seep into our water and into our air.
Oh, that's quite the illuminating explanation. I like that. Does organic farming cost more?
I wouldn't say so. Everything in the capitalist setup is supply and demand. So maybe 40 years ago, they didn't really care about organic food. It was about conventional, how much you can produce, how much you can get out in the marketplace. Now them same foods there have made thousands of people sick, and now everybody is backtracking to say, you know, I used to eat this, I used to, and I never ask any question. Now I'm asking questions and I'm learning more. I don't want the conventional food. I want things that are clean, that will not impact my body in a negative way. So again, supply and demand, the cost has gone up. But if you're growing small scale, so you have 1,000 square foot and you want that to feed your household, if you're not making your own compost, you should learn how to start doing that. Learn how to, you know, grow your own worms, which are red wigglers that are good for the soil in agriculture. And always put back your food scrap. If you don't want to set up a physical compost bin, always dig a hole where you're growing or you're gardening, and chop up your food scrap and put it in the hole and cover it so that it turns into carbon. And it keeps building your soil, because when we have these monsoon rains and hurricanes in the world, what happens is that it takes at least, I think they said 4 to 6 inches of topsoil back into the ocean. So we always have to keep building. That's a part of food insecurity. We always have to keep building topsoil so that we can produce, you know, have a huge scale of production happening, you know, so some crops come in 30 days, some come 60, and some come 90, some 120, 150, or depending on what it is. The quick cash crop is 90 days the most, right? And so when they start to come in, and you can, once they finish their cycle, you can rotate them out and rotate another crop in. That is the quote-unquote organic system. You're always on this quick rotation basis. So kale, Swiss chard, collard greens, cabbage, onion, tomato, garlic, sweet potato, okra, all these things, hot pepper, sweet pepper, tomatillos. There's so many things. Chocho, so many things you can grow within the spectrum of time that we are allotted. So in Canada and in Toronto where we are, when March comes in, by mid-March, say the week of the 15th, you can start to seed plants. So you can start sowing your seeds in a greenhouse space or maybe in your own home. And then once it gets warmer, progressively warmer, then you start moving them outside, still taking care of them, and so they can get used to the air. And then once it gets a little bit warmer, then you can start to transplant things like your onion, your scallion, your cabbage, herbs, and they like the spring weather. Napa cabbage, bok choy, pak choy, pak soy.
Man.
You can put those.
You're making me hungry already.
You can put those in the ground because they like the cooler climate. When it gets to June now, you can start to put things in like the hot crops, like the hot peppers, sweet pepper, callaloo, tomato, all of those things, okra, eggplants. They like the hotter climate.
Right, that's delightful.
Thank you for playing that piece, James. I have to apologize to folks. I see there is a huge Black symposium, Black Farmer Symposium happening in Ontario currently as we speak. They're a little bit delayed, and Jackie is currently speaking there with the Minister of Agriculture directly about Black farmers and Black issues. So I will speak towards Miss Jackie's slides and talk a little bit about what she wanted to come in and say. Thanks, James. You can go ahead. Okay, Toronto Black farmers. So Toronto Black farmers, the lead farmers is Jacqueline Dwyer and Noel, and they are Food Growers Collective, and there's a 13-year urban farm existing in the heart of Downsview Park in the north side of the park, intersection of Keele Street and Shepherd Avenue West. They're a resident-led group, changing the narratives and making good food accessible to Black households. And they ensure low-income Black households considered food insecure in 34 neighborhoods across the GTA a priority to have access to their urban farm and to their offerings, of which also includes schools. Many of the schools in the Jane and Finch area, which they're closest to, receive many of the goods that they're growing from that farm, which is actually also on federal land in Downsview Park. And they continuously stand against food poverty, social injustice, systematic oppression, and systematic anti-Black racism. But we work with allies that support their mission and their objective. Next slide, please. So their current problem, and they've been speaking about this for a while, is about infrastructure development. That's actually what she's on the panel talking about, and how Black farmers are getting access to supports for infrastructure. Well, the problem is that they have a lack of commercial scale cooler and certified commercial kitchen. And without these resources, their fresh harvested produce from the farm needing refrigeration lessens the shelf life. I'm sure there's many farmers in the room, and we know what this is like. Education and training is their mission to pass on our cultural food knowledge and preparation knowledge to youth and others that don't have this knowledge. A commercial certified kitchen is needed on the farm to empower their offerings in both areas. Traceability to our ecological, fresh cultural relevancy and affordability is relevant to the Afro-diasporic basin is vital. These foods Black households should be consuming more of fresh and locally. So their solution is that they would like to purchase 10 times 12 feet trailers and retrofitting them with youth and trades professionals on site for commercial farm use. The Toronto Black Farmers and Farming Growing Collective is expanding into a weekly farmers market ecological food production training with welcome and teaching garden, a seasonal rental plot to train other Black people interested in agricultural and sustainable food. Right there, I just wanted to stop. You know, when you visit the farm that the Toronto Black farmers are on, they are very open. Many farmers have a chance to be a little bit hidden on their properties, but they are at the corner of Keele and Shepherd, where people are coming off of the bus. It's a quite busy space. There's a greenhouse. And I mean, even when they're growing and cutting, people are walking into the space and asking, can we learn to farm? I know that makes it quite difficult, but Miss Jacqueline Dwyer is so open to supporting folks with some of those pieces. And they do school tours, corporate tours, workshops, pop-up community food pantry twice a month, and a collective food buying club for interested parties. And I know quite a few community members who have reaped the benefits of the collective food buying club. Next slide, please. And they have a market. It's their clean food market, and it serves the community in Downsview and across the GTA. They are the co-founder of the Afro-Caribbean Farmers Market. That is a market that came up into Little Jamaica. For those who are part of Jamaica, there is a historical space that now has heritage marking called Little Jamaica along Eglinton West. And they are part of co-founding the Afro-Caribbean Farmers Market, which is an open air market in Little Jamaica, and it starts in mid-June and ends in August. In the farmers market, they create their own crypto Calulu Cash, which is funded through grants but supports market users to stretch their dollars for food purchases in the market. Great market. If you're in Toronto, you should check it out. And their prices are affordable, and their produce is in demand. I can definitely attest to that. I've worked quite a few times in their farmers markets with them, and when we pull out that Calulu, it goes quite quickly. Next slide, please. Their competition for Black household dollars are other cultural groups selling what our communities use in their kitchens. We always use our cultural through locally produced food to sell our produce through markets, CSAs, and prescription orders. They have quite a huge CSA or prescription order coming in through their local farm over there. And continued spread of information, not just within the local Jane and Finch, Keele, and Shepherd area, but across the Greater Toronto area, as previously mentioned, sourcing 34 communities across the Greater Toronto area, and creating what we need now to dismantle and grow more producers for the pending food crisis in a seasonal climate. You know, that's been a conversation that many of farmers have talked about, the shifting climate that we're experiencing during our growing season, and also attempting to grow culturally appropriate foods for communities that you are looking to work with. Next slide, please. And their business model, they're currently a registered not-for-profit organization in Ontario. 85% of their revenue streams comes from selling the produce they grow. Another 10% comes from farm tours, and the other 5% from plot rentals at the beginning of the season. What is required for the farm comes from the income of the sales of produce. Sometimes we write grants, and sometimes they get donations towards the work that they do. I think for those of you who have heard Miss Jackie speak, she's quite vocal about where in particularly Black farmers are getting access or not getting access to funding models in the space. So as you see, most of their 13-year production has been funded by themselves, in particularly what they've been growing in the ground, and then some additional add-ons with some grants where it's been accessible and some other spaces, foundation donations. Next slide, please. And their impact is to give harvested produce longer shelf life and have more produce on hand for sale. The commercial cooler and certified kitchen will be operated off the grid and powered by a solar panel and renewable batteries. They've started that work inside of the farm with solar powered pieces, and it's expanding, and I think that's great. In the retrofitting both trailers, we will make this into a community workshop with the professionals facilitating the training. So looking to retrofit and teach other community members. I know that this has come up within my space in the National Farmers Union around how do we get these coolers up and running to help with extended shelf life of cut vegetables. And having a mobile commercial scale cooler and mobile certified kitchen to move on wheels when we need to store and when we need to engage in other food prep activities. Their marketing and sales. Their marketing is to market their farmers markets, the CSAs that will support Black households to eat better and encourage more tourist visits and events on the site, which again is at Downsview Park on the northwest corner. And most of our customers are returning customers, word of mouth and through social media. And their advertising is each one brings one. And that has proven to be, I always say Black communities build things on the margins. The Toronto Black farmers have built this immaculate space that, you just run into community members. People go grocery shopping there. They're on site and ready to cut for you at any point in time, sell produce. And it's really created this home space. And I know that Miss Jackie is looking to expand this conversation, expand this work across the city. Next slide, please. And their management team they do have a farm manager, which is Miss Jackie, an operational site manager, which is Noel, the social media manager. I'm not sure who's behind the social media, but I always say if you think it's Miss Jackie, it probably isn't. And a food system builder and event and activity planner. And their milestones, they've been collaborating and partnering with other Black farming groups as they continue to grow and develop, create additional frames of Black food work, journey, space, and their experience. They expand on their value-added systems and research more culturally relevant crops in their offering. So they've been expanding. We have quite a bit of great culturally appropriate crops happening with them. I know I'm coming from Trinidad and Tobago. They have great what we call pimento peppers or flavor peppers that they have managed to regrow and extend the shelf life of those there. So yeah, they are bringing a lot of crops that we don't necessarily see and accomplish this mission in building out a community food space with the necessary amendments and staff to operate the site 2026 and onward. Next slide. This is just a look at their financials. I'm not sure, so that would have been something that Jackie would have walked us through, but definitely I can see that that's their revenue through some grants that they've received, and then some other pieces that they're working towards. And if you want to get in touch with Jacqueline Dwyer, or Noel Livingston, the farm manager, this is the address that you can find the farm at. There's a phone number that you can reach them at, and then that's their email and their website. Please do take some time to check out the work of the Toronto Black farmers. Again, please accept my apologies on behalf of the Toronto Black farmers. There's, I hope that we continue to have these conversations about what Black farmers need, not just in the month of February, that we continue it out throughout the year, because this tends to be what happens. You have one Black farmer being asked to be in 17 different rooms at the same time, and they're definitely trying to accommodate because they think it's important to share the information, but sometimes it becomes a little bit difficult. So please accept my apology on behalf of the Toronto Black farmers. But if you reach out to Miss Jacqueline Dwyer, I am sure she will have a long and fruitful conversation with you about the work that they've been doing for the last 13 years.
And we also have the follow-up session on next
we do.
Thursday outside of Black History Month. So we're already starting that work. James, you can keep the slides up if you want. We're going to ask Isaac to come back on for Q&A. if Isaac's there. Awesome, thank you. So I want to open it up. You can either put your questions in the chat. Oh, people are already there. First question, Peach, if you want to join, is do you know if Jacqueline Dwyer is meeting with the federal Minister of Agriculture or the Ontario Minister?
Agri-Foods Canada. That is at the Black Symposium currently being held at University of Guelph. The research person is a woman by the name of Marsha. I think it started off a little bit tiny, but it has gotten quite big. So Agri-Foods Canada. But there are other agricultural folks, including Ontario folks, sitting on the panel with her.
Awesome. Isaac, thank you so much. I think everything you spoke about was so rich and full. Like I said, before I start with any questions, if anyone from the audience wants to add a question in the chat that we can go off of.
I do want to thank you, Isaac, for really pushing forward the representation of Black women at the forefront of this work, because many times they are the ones kind of bubbling up and pushing forward and really cutting that pathway of attempting to acquire land, work with land, feed their families, redistribute medicine, even sitting in my ancestral lands, my father reminding me that the land that you're sitting on was like, that is your grandmother, like the women always tend to go forward and look for this attempt to make space in the longevity for family and space for us to build in that way. So thank you for bringing that piece forward.
Welcome. Well, I would say it's a necessary corrective to the way women, particularly Black women, have been written out of the histories of the civil rights movement, the histories of the Panthers, even though that's now being addressed. And, women tend to be more consistently, shall we say, committed to the emancipatory project than men. Okay, people can argue for a variety of resocialization historically and so forth, but you see it coming out time and time again in the stories. Like, for example, I teach I coordinate the Black and African Diaspora Studies degree program here at Dalhousie University, the first of its kind in Canada, and perhaps the most comprehensive. I've been talking about the Maroons, right? The various Maroon communities, particularly in Jamaica. Nani was uncompromising, right? Others for various reasons. I don't made concessions to the British imperial power, while others didn't, right? And then this issue of land itself, right, becomes so central, right, and so forth. So it's hard when you think about it. It's really the relationship between humans and the land has been ruptured, right? Just as the relationships between humans have been ruptured by the economic system we live in, right? And so, in a sense, one of the so my colleague, Dr. Chevy Eugene, who's from Saney, based in Toronto, who works with me in the program, he does a lot of work on reparations. We do a lot of stuff on reparative justice. And so part of repairing, aside from the economic and social justice and the question of redistribution of land, is repairing our relationship with each other and also repairing our relationship with the land. And that metabolic relationship has been shattered by capitalism and imperialism.
I think that's a great point. That's something that, I met Miss Jackie when I was 27. I'm almost 50 or 25, somewhere around there. And that's always consistently both her and Nadine's conversations around how we reconnect to land and what justice on the land looks like for our community and how we work with Indigenous people of the land as Black folks. And that's been their consistent push. And I think it's quite important for us to keep talking about, and in particularly bringing it forward so that the erasure, as you say, stops, I see it happening even in current agricultural spaces right now, and women just tend to stay steady and continue to advance the pieces of work that need to happen on the ground, in particularly re-threading our community back to land. because as you mentioned at the beginning, our access to land is not by mistake. Our non-attachment to land didn't happen by mistake. It's a system that's been placed upon us, and Jackie, and as well as Nadine and other people on the forefront of this radical farming space, have really worked to re-thread our communities back to land. What does it feel like to touch the soil again? What does it feel like to start planting a seed? What does it feel like to plant a tree? And I come to my home here, and there's trees planted on my land that I know my grandfather planted, and I'm still reaping the benefit of it. And watching these processes. Yeah.
There's a question from the chat that asks you, Isaac, is there an ability to expand your land base considering that you were located in an area that has the highest priced lands? And are there similar Black communities in rural areas where land may be more accessible?
Yeah. Well, what's happening, if I can talk about Halifax, right? We've witnessed the gentrification, right? And I was actually just giving a lecture just before here, a public lecture called Revolutionary Roots, the Global Black Liberation Struggle and the Making of Modern Africa in Nova Scotia. And I delivered it at North Branch Library, which is at the center of a Black community. Anybody who's been to Nova Scotia, and if you've been to Nova Scotia maybe 30 years ago, you'd know that the Gottingen Street area and all that was a Black community, right? It was a place, where when I was a student, I hung out with, I had family members there and so forth, right? And so my Nova Scotia family, right? So what happened, that whole place has been gentrified, right? So it was a place where people actually, let's get back to it was not valuable land. The place was, all sorts of stigmatisms were applied to it, right? It was disparaged and so forth. And that land has been bought up and the community has been dispossessed, right? Okay. The rural communities, and where Nova Scotia operates is that we have issues of land title issues where when we had the major migrations of the historic community with the Black loyalists, in the 1780s, and then what we call the Black refugees who come after the War of 1812, is it ended up with giving what were licenses of location or tickets, licenses of occupation or tickets of location. You can stay here. This land is not considered valuable. At least at the time it wasn't considered valuable, right? Okay. And you can stay here. So you have some sort of what they call in law usufruct, but you have no title to this land, right? And so you're settled. And this is the same thing with Africville, where if everybody familiar with the story of Africville, and my great grandmother lived in Africville, right, for a time period. When you look at Africville, it's on the Bedford Basin, and when they were settled, that land was considered worthless, right? Okay, but when the needs and the economic nature of Halifax changed and they began to expand, suddenly worthless land in the eyes of these elites became valuable industrial land. And there's actually a resolution, I think, in 1947 in the Halifax city that talks about this, right? And so you have the communities being pushed out, right? So one of the problems that's actually emerged is that you have this economic pressure of capitalism pressuring these people, buying their land up and then developing it, right? And then you end up with these overpriced condominiums and apartment buildings and so forth where people can't afford. But also you have members of, then you have these rural communities that were on the outskirts. I think I mentioned this in my presentation, right? Far enough away to be socially separate, but close enough to come in as cheap labor, right? But suddenly these become very attractive for people who want summer homes, and developers are going there. So this, as I said, this land that was not considered valuable is now, you have this tremendous pressure, right? And what's happened is that Black communities are disappearing, right? And people who inherit this land want to sell the land, right? Okay, as well. And Nova Scotia, I always like to say the Maritime province's greatest export in the 20th century, at least the second half of the 20th century, is people. They go to central Canada, or in the case they go to Alberta and West, right? So people are leaving, right, because of lack of opportunities. So we're losing this land. So even in the rural communities, the land is disappearing, right? So if anybody's been to Nova Scotia, Beachville has basically dwindled as a community. If people remember Beachville, right? Okay. Also the Prestons, okay, these famous communities now are facing this land pressures. People sell their land, right? And then what's happened as well, this is how the system works, right, is that people didn't receive title to their land. So, people lived for several generations on this land, couldn't pass it on to family members, right? Okay, legally, right? Okay, couldn't divide it up among family members, right? Couldn't, zone it properly, right? Because, they don't own title to the land. Suddenly, people were worried about the precarity of holding on to this land, that they could lose it. And so a movement developed. And so now the province stepped in with a little bit of money to help people survey their land and, finally secure a real legal title as it exists under this capitalist system. Suddenly, You have disputes among family members. Which piece of land do I want? Some people want to sell, right? And so forth, right? Instead of this idea of seeing the land collectively, right? As a community resource, right? And so then you have this individualism, this idea of private property, right? Where I can sell this land and I don't have a duty to the community. You have some people who have this overall vision, but you have others who think, listen, I can sell the land, right? To a developer and I can make money. So this is some of the big issues that have actually emerged in the community as well, right? And of course, there are, the community is not monolithic. There are class divisions, right, that are increasingly emerging, the schism, right? So these are some of the things that have emerged as well. And so the pressures exist within Halifax where land prices are very high and housing prices are very high, to even into the rural areas. And we have a lot of people, who have money who may just want to come from some places in the States or somewhere else. There were a lot of people coming from Europe buying a property in the rural areas because they have the money and they can come and summer there, right? And so forth. So there's all of these particular pressures, right? So what we need, which is why when we think of reparations, right, and we think of how reparations relates to land, I mean, the reparations movement isn't about money, right? Okay, it's not us as Asata Shakur. You can't expect the people who've oppressed and disenfranchised you to enfranchise and stop their oppression, right? What it is about is understanding we need fundamental socio-economic transformation, right? Okay, and that requires, once we have a fundamental, it changes our conception of what land means, right? Can we return to an idea of communal land ownership after we've been centuries where land is seen as individual, right? And if you go back to, I don't want to oversimplify John Locke and Thomas Hobbes because they get oversimplified, right? But no, this idea that land itself, and even going back to the dominionists who draw from the Bible, land only has value if it can be exploited. It can be commodified, right? Okay. So can we return? Right. And I think to do that, before we can make that psychological, and if I may use the term spiritual return, we need a fundamental material transformation. Right. And when you look at the world we're living in, like in my province, for example, right. Okay. So we see Trump is going to drill. He wants to drill in the Arctic. Right. He wants to do all this drilling, all this fracking. We have the same things people talking about here in Nova Scotia with this government, right? And so we have this political fight. So we have a political material fight that we have to wage along with the spiritual transformation. And I'm not a religious person, right? But there's a spiritual try to being a human being. Okay. And so this and land itself, to have that repair of our relationship requires, to love the land, if I may say so, right? Okay, which is, it's like, it's a good thing. I spend a lot of time with Rastas, right? You got to love the land, right? Okay. And in order to make that a broader project, right, requires some very fundamental political and economic change, right? And we haven't even discussed, we mentioned the ecological the catastrophe that hangs over all of us, right? And we know it's places like the Caribbean, the most thoroughly colonized spaces that are most vulnerable to ecological collapse. And then even within places like Canada, it's going to be, the black folk, indigenous folk, and the poor, right, and working people who are going to be the most vulnerable. So, I think the spiritual transformation and the revolutionary social economic transformation have to go hand in hand.
Absolutely. And I think I wanted to maybe expand that if no one else has a question on how does this also relate to when we talk about not just you were talking about the reparation movement, but I think it goes deeply hand in hand with agricultural land reform. Because I think though you've talked about many projects like in Burkina Faso with Thomas Sankara, like with the other African revolutionary movements, and even with Haiti, right? And all of these other Caribbean movements. And what we think of here, obviously, we are in a settler colonial colony. There is a lot of knowledge that the Black revolutionary tradition and Black land reforms have had. How do you think that history and that knowledge can be unified and synthesized in these movements here as well? Like, how do we understand the values Black revolutionary agrarian reform have, and how are we synthesizing it here as well?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, and I don't know if I have an adequate answer to that, right? Okay, because we're thinking that through as well. What does it mean in theory and praxis, right? But I think one of the first things is to demonstrate that it's possible, right? I mean, the one thing I mentioned, like when you think of Cabral, for example, or you think of what was happening in Cuba during the Cuban Revolution, as they were carrying on these liberated things, they carried on reforms in the liberated. They hadn't won the wars yet. And they carried on these reforms in the liberated territories, right? Land reform. I mean, in fact, under the liberation movement Cabral led, they would have these elections, right? And at least two out of of these elections elect these 5-member councils, and at least 2 of them had to be women. Okay, so they're carrying on all of these reforms. So I think it demonstrates it's possible not only to envision, to have the radical imagination of visioning a different future, but it's actually possible to put it into place, right? Why else would the imperial powers spend so much time trying to destroy these examples? Why did they spend so much time destroying Haiti, right? Okay, Haiti as an example of African people rising up and seizing control of their destiny, but also resisting the imperial powers and assisting other countries as well, and also trying to achieve what they were doing. And it was that imperial pressure, right, that in a sense, I would argue, made Toussaint Louverture make some missteps, right? Okay, when he had to, he needed to have funds to buy weapons to defend the revolutionary project, and he had to go back to mass plantations, right? And the way he did it was very undemocratic, it was imposed, right? Okay. The same thing they're trying to impose on Cuba, which is to make the fact that an alternative system will seem not viable in people's eyes, right? Because people will not see that it's imperial aggression. The same thing they did in Mozambique, the same thing they did in Angola, right? I mean, these were incredible projects of emancipation, and they stepped in and destroyed it, because when you employ imperial aggression, you create distortions, you force centralizations because you have to defend yourself and so forth. But for a brief moment, we can see examples of that, right? And when you look at these, when I mentioned the video, when Basil Davidson is looking at these women, these emancipated women farming projects in Mozambique, you see the joy, okay, because they are in control of their lives, right? They're exercising self. So I think it demonstrates for us that it's possible to do this, right? How do we do it in a Canadian context? Obviously, in a settler colonial state. How would you do it with Indigenous people? How and even in Indigenous communities, right? Like even in prosperous, like for example, we have some prosperous First Nations communities. We have 13 official First Nations communities in Halifax. Some are more prosperous than others. Some are making a lot of money, but they're making it as capitalists, right? Okay, so they themselves in some ways have abandoned that fundamental relationship between human and the land, right? So how do we come back to actually in that conversation and dialogue and collaboration and cooperation, recreate a new view on how land should be, right? And of course, who knows, like, if I was just watching news, who knows if war is going to break out in the Middle East, right? Okay. If the US is going to launch this war against Iran, and whatever people may think of the Iranian government, it's up for the Iranian people, in my opinion, to determine whatever system, and they're not open to, and for the US to simply attack them, it has nothing to do with the rights of the Iranian people. It's about controlling, that part of the world. If war does break out there, that will have significant impact on the world economy, on supply, on fuel. What happens to people's access to food, right? And how do we achieve food sovereignty? And that necessarily remains like either you retreat into these survivalist things where it's every dog for themselves and we fight and kill each other, as you see in those movies, or we find ways to be cooperative, right? And collaborative and sharing and communal, right? So I know that's not an adequate answer, but I would think that we can look into the past and we can see, yes, not only did people envision a different future, they were actually, at least for brief periods of time, able to create these spaces, right? That show that it's possible.
And I want to, and I'm sure, especially because you're a scholar in Cuba and in the Caribbean, that these examples of land reform, you saw Haiti when they were able to liberate themselves. They also made open calls to indigenous peoples from the Americas to join. So could you maybe speak a little bit about that? Because I think that's also important when we think of the context, even with Black Scotians. And I can speak, being based in so-called Alberta, the connection between Black settler farming communities and their indigenous neighbors, and a lot of the Black agrarian histories in the Americas and liberations are tied in hand with indigenous liberation movements as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a complicated story, but there are times of Black indigenous joint struggles for liberation, and then the system, the state, complicates it because it finds ways to directly disarticulate those moments of solidarity. And of course, when peoples begin to accept the economic, political, and social structures, right, that the exploiting oppressive classes and colonizers have imposed on them, it changes how they relate to other folks and so on. But we have examples of joint struggle. For example, the Seminole Wars, right? in Florida, for example, right? We have the Garifuna, for example, right? We have cooperation between the American Indian Movement and the Black Panther Party in the United States, right? So we have examples of that where people have joined together. We also have in Bolivia under Mas, right? When before the fissures occurred in the movement in Bolivia and over Morales and others with it. Bolivia actually passed constitutional protections for the Afro-Bolivian community, right? And we're trying to organize a trip there, if we can manage it, right? To go and see what they've done as well, right? As well. So we have examples of this where oppressed and exploited people, whatever their specificities, have found moments of actually cooperating and so forth, right? And of course, I'm a Cuba specialist, and we have what Cuba has done in Africa, and specifically, Cubans of African descent, and a significant portion of Cubans of African descent, maybe at least 60, 75% people debate the figures, but they reconnected with Africa, and not only did they aid Africa in its anti-colonial national liberation struggle, and I've written a book on this, right? And with a lot of stuff, they played a central role in defeating the apartheid state, right? And hundreds of thousands of Cubans served in Africa, and over 2,000 died in those struggles. But also we have doctors and educators going there, right, as well to aid Cuba, to aid Africa and so forth. I mean, Cuba is the only country in Latin America where it officially describes itself as a Latin African nation, right? And it's the only country in the international sphere that says that humanity owes a debt to Africa, right? And so they've actually done this. And within Cuba itself, I should point out, and I know this is probably a little off topic from farming, but in Cuba, what you have now is they've also engaged in their own dialogue about how far they domestically have to go. And there's a major program called Colo Cubano, okay, which is a detailed program. I was there at the national, provincial, and municipal level to deal with racial inequality, right? They say we've accomplished so much in combating this. How much further do we have to go in all these other spheres and so forth? But of course, it's under siege. And when you're under siege, these emancipatory projects, some of the things have to be put on hold because you're fighting for survival, and that's what imperialism does. They put us under siege, right? And then capitalism infiltrates us, right? Infiltrates all of us, right? Okay, I was just enjoying a wonderful French pastry, right? When I was offline here, it infiltrates. Do I need a French pastry? Oh my goodness, motion. Okay, but it infiltrates us, right? Spiritually as well. So it's a very tough battle. But as I said before, I think we have examples from the past we can draw on, right? My last point is that for me, things like Cuba, things like Haiti before it was besieged and all this, demonstrate that you can have a society based on the ethos of solidarity, the ethos of being, where my self-worth is defined by how much social love I can show other human beings, as opposed to the ethos of having, where my self-worth is defined by how many material goods I acquire, right? And of course, we are all affected by that, right? Okay, but I think it's possible to create alternative societies.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to wrap up with just reminding people that 2026 is the year of the woman farmer. So I think it made me so happy how much we were able to highlight Black women at the forefront of our food sovereignty movement. So, James, if you can pull the slides up, we're going to remind everyone that, again, you can access this recording when it's made available, and join more NFU universities by going to www.nfu.ca/join. Move on to the next slide. Yes, so what is new to this year's NF University series is that next week, on March 5th, the same Thursday, we're going to have an organizing session where I think Isaac said a lot. A lot of what we said was theory, a lot was history, a lot was contextualizing, but we're going to focus next week on how to put this into practice. What is happening right now that is connected to a lot of the things we're talking about, especially even knowing more about what's happening with Jacqueline's amazing food project in Toronto, and get to know more. And hopefully, like Peachtree said, if Nadine can't show up, she'll send a video speaking more about practice. Like, what is the praxis? What is being put into practice now that we can all get involved in? And how is the NFU connected to a lot of the things we were talking about? Because there's amazing avenues in the NFU where we're working on this kind of policy work. We're working in the BIPOC caucus. We're working in a lot of different areas in the union that touches on food sovereignty, but especially Black food sovereignty, and how we as Black farmers in this country have roles in our collective food sovereignty. So thank you so much. I'm going to pass it on to Peach.
Yes, thank you so much for attending. I'm excited that we'll be working outside of the Black History Month 4 week span, and that we will continue to be talking about some of the things that are not just relevant to Black farmers in Canada, but how we connect on a global scale, and how we are working across boundaries, including going into the South, into the global South, how we work with each other. So this is great work for us to continue.
Thank you, everyone.